You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 21st of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Israel accuses Hamas of a ceasefire violation of the utmost severity. We'll explain why and whether the talks over a longer-term peace deal can survive. Also ahead,
there's a need for mainstream politics to think outside the box, but to still remember where the box is. And some of the insurgent parties and insurgent governments, they can do away with the box in its entirety. That is not what voters are looking for.
The final installment of our German election series looks at the evolution of the Christian Democrats from Angela Merkel to Friedrich Merz. We'll also hear why New Zealand is upset with the Cook Islands. And after that,
it highlights how important it is to develop a whole service family that integrates seamlessly into your everyday service.
We discover Finland's digital agency and how it has become an example of best in class for its peers. And finally, Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi is fresh off the catwalk to bring us highlights of day one of London Fashion Week. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The continuing release of Israeli hostages by Hamas has taken a particularly grim turn this week, as Israel announced that among 4 bodies returned by Hamas was a Gazan woman and not the hostage Shiri Bibas that Hamas had promised to release. The revelation has put an already fragile ceasefire in Gaza under further strain. It also comes amid a bomb attack on buses in Tel Aviv that prompted Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to announce a renewed operation in the West Bank. Well, I'm joined now by the foreign correspondent Hannah McCarthy. Hannah, what can you tell us, first of all, about the release of these bodies by Hamas?
Sure. So 4 bodies were released by Hamas. They include Oded Lifshitz, an 84-year-old peace activist who was living in kibbutz called Nir Oz. The bodies of 2 young children, Ariel and Kafir Bibas, were also returned to Israel on Thursday. And then there was a 4th body that Hamas said was the body of the children's mother, Shiri Bibas. But after the IDF conducted DNA testing, they said that this body did not match Shiri's DNA, and it did not, in fact, match the DNA of any other of a hostage. Hamas has said that this was not deliberate. Hamas's claims around the deaths of these hostages is that they died by an Israeli strike. The Israeli government has said that they were murdered. Neither of these claims have been independently verified. But what Hamas says is that when Shiri Bibas was killed in what they say was an Israeli airstrike, that her body, her remains were mixed with the remains of other Palestinians who were at the same home. So again, a very sad time for the Bibas family. The father of the family was returned alive only recently. And again, the kibbutz has said that they want this ceasefire to continue. They do not want revenge, but it is important that the remains of Shiri Bibas are returned to her family.
And just tell us a little more, Hannah, about why particularly Shiri Bibas has been a sort of symbolic figure during this the war with Hamas.
Well, people may have seen footage of Shiri Bibas, clutching her 2 young children after they were taken hostage on the 7th of October. The images of her 2 young children, one was just a 9-month-old baby, have become a kind of symbol for the hostage families about, and a rallying call to the rest of the world. And again, until this week, there were still hopes from the Bibas family that the children might be returned alive. It was not a good sign when in the first ceasefire they were not returned along with the other children who were taken hostage. And again, this week has been kind of a sad confirmation for the Bibas family who were holding out, kind of a small amount of hope that they might return alive to Israel.
Now, Hannah, I do also have to ask you about Tel Aviv, where there were a series of explosions. What do we know about that?
Sure. So there were 3 explosions on 3 different buses in southern Tel Aviv on Thursday evening. There were no casualties reported. The Israeli Shin Bet has said that there is an Israeli suspect who has been detained, who they say was involved in the placing of those explosive devices. And what we understand from police statements is that there was messages left in some of the explosive devices with words like Tulkarm, which is a Palestinian camp in the West Bank. And we also have a statement from the Tulkarm Brigade, which again is a militant group based in the West Bank, which said that, revenge for the martyrs will not be forgotten as the occupiers sit on our land. So these kind of attacks are very reminiscent of the Second Intifada. When there was a host of kind of attacks on buses and for the Israeli public, they are designed to kind of invoke terror. Buses were stopped. It kind of hinders public transport. But at the same time, there were no casualties from those strikes.
And this has also led to then a further operation in the West Bank that Prime Minister Netanyahu announced. How expansive is that likely to be?
Well, there's already been a significant increase in the military presence in the West Bank following the ceasefire in Gaza. And on Friday, the Israeli army announced that it would deploy 3 battalions to the West Bank. So again, another increase in what is already, an unprecedented presence of Israeli military in the West Bank. There's about 40,000 Palestinians who are displaced from their homes in the West Bank. There's airstrikes have been used on Jenin and in Tulkarm. So again, all of this is going to add to the pressure cooker that is the West Bank at the moment.
And just finally then, Hannah, where does this leave us if you can sort of sum up? Could we see an end to the ceasefire in Gaza as a result of this, let alone conflict in the West Bank?
I think all the signs are still that people want this ceasefire to continue, and that that Hamas has actually named the 6 hostages are to be released at this weekend. All of this is adding pressure to that deal, but it looks like it is still going to go ahead. What we see from the Trump administration is still a very clear sign that they want this phase of the ceasefire concluded, and they want the second phase. Obviously, the Trump administration is liable to change its mind on that. But at the moment, the clear sign is that the US wants this ceasefire deal, and they seem to have the ability to shepherd Netanyahu's government towards that.
Hannah, thank you very much. That was the foreign correspondent, Hannah McCarthy. And now here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Police in South Korea are formally building a case against impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol over accusations he obstructed the execution of an arrest warrant. Yoon did not comply with a warrant that was part of a criminal investigation over his martial law decree, blocking investigators for days. If found guilty, he faces up to 5 years in jail for obstruction of justice. The Chinese Navy has undertaken a live fire drill in the seas between Australia and New Zealand, prompting the diversion of commercial flights in the skies above. The naval exercise was conducted in international waters, with the warships changing formation, placing a target in the water and then recovering it. The drills were observed by a New Zealand Navy vessel. And a court in Germany has ruled that Birkenstock sandals are a piece of design and not art. The footwear giant has sought copyrighted work of applied art status for its classic sandals to prevent competitors from selling similar models. Read more about it in our daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. And now for the final installment of our German elections series. Many listeners, particularly in Germany, may remember this.
Wir haben so vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das. Wir schaffen das, und wo uns etwas im Wege steht, muss es überwunden werden.
Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's famous "We can do this, wir schaffen das" speech back in 2015. And this is Merkel's successor as head of the Christian Democrats.
Ich habe diesen Kurs in der Bundestagsfraktion und auch in der Partei, der CDU, korrigiert.
Friedrich Merz saying Merkel was wrong and the migration policy he has corrected. Merz is the likely next Chancellor of Germany, and here is a look into his party's evolution on migration, the central issue of this year's election campaign.
Police has to solve a problem instantly. They come to a scene, something has happened, and they need to solve the problem. They need to find a solution. They need to help clear the situation and do it instantly. And politics obviously works very different.
This is Verena Mertens, one of the newest members of the European Parliament, elected for Germany's Christian Democrats last year. She's also a former chief of police in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia.
This is the reason I came to politics, to maybe bring some of that into politics. But I found it's quite hard. Politicians like to describe the problem in a very, long, prolonged way. Maybe we should, stop talking so much about it and say what exactly we can do, like as a concrete idea to make it better. I'm missing that sometimes, and I'm trying to push for that.
Mertens has entered politics at a time where her own background will be valuable to the CDU. With Germany facing federal elections on Sunday, crime and migration have been the overriding voter concern, particularly after a spate of very public attacks in Germany over the past year, some of which were committed by former or current asylum seekers. Those attacks have dominated the election campaign and prompted calls for more stringent migration policies. As a former police detective, Mertens says that nuance is often lost in the discussion.
We have to distinguish the reasons for the attacks and who committed them. It's not so easy. You can't say it's only the migrants who attack people here. Those attacks can always happen again, even though we have less migration. So it's a problem that we have to address on many levels.
And yet it is the CDU, her party, that has taken the lead in confronting migration, essentially calling for a permanent stop to asylum seekers coming into Germany, even as it claims to be a pro-European Union party advocating a European solution. Mertens defends the CDU's approach.
I don't see it as a contradiction, especially what the CDU plans. What Germany is doing is they're now securing the internal, like the borders, like within Europe, because the external borders are not secured properly and the migration pact is not working.
Mertens insists that the CDU would lift restrictions again once the European borders are under control. But the CDU's approach has been controversial, not just for the issue of migration itself, but also for how it has tried to get a bill passed. After an attack in Aschaffenburg in January, the CDU and its leader Friedrich Merz, Germany's likely next chancellor if polls are to be believed, attempted to pass a bill in the German Bundestag with support from the far-right Alternative for Germany. The CDU has defended its actions ever since. Here's Mertens again.
Of course, I don't want to work together with parties on the far right at all. I don't want to work with them. They are crazy. But if I think something's right, I want to push forward with that idea, no matter who supports it.
This is the fine line that the CDU has been walking in the run-up to this election. A promise to confront migration, while insisting it is not as draconian as the far-right AfD. A promise to adhere to German orthodoxy, a firewall of never working with far-right parties, while also attempting to pass an immigration bill with the AfD's tacit support.
We are in disruptive times, and the CDU's policy agenda, they're talking about tax cuts and controls on immigration. That's all well and good, but it needs more than words. It needs disruptive policy ideas.
This is Ryan Wayne, Executive Director of Politics at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which has been running surveys exploring the divide in Germany and elsewhere between voters attracted to the extremes and those who back the mainstream.
There's a need for mainstream politics to think outside the box, but to still remember where the box is. And some of the insurgent parties and insurgent governments, they can do away with the box in its entirety. That is not what voters are looking for. But what they are looking for is ideas and solutions that work and start to point to a better, more hopeful, more optimistic future.
The Blair Institute's report found that migration was a bigger topic in Germany at the moment than almost anywhere else, driving support for the AfD and explaining the CDU's efforts to address the topic itself. All of this has taken the wind out of the sails of another party, the Free Democrats, or FDP, traditional partners of the Christian Democrats and the free market alternative. The party is in danger of falling out of parliament as the AFD makes gains.
Within the very heated debate of current elections, the campaigns that are running at the moment, sometimes it's a bit difficult to talk about the economy rather than about what do we do with right-wing parties, what do we do with migration and stuff like this.
This is Lukas Köhler, a Bavarian parliamentarian of the Free Democratic Party.
The FDP is not part of the parliament. We will have lesser pressure on big reforms that are very much needed in Germany at the moment. And that will be lacking. And that we've seen this lack on an optimistic, technological, friendly, technological, open party. So I do think that liberals are very much needed in German politics.
The FDP's departure from parliament, if it does not garner 5% of the vote, would leave Friedrich Merz's Christian Democrats as the only centre-right party holding the line against the far-right extremes. It would also make forming a coalition government after the election even more difficult than it already is. But more on that particular pickle next week after Sunday's results. You are back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. Earlier this week, the Cook Islands in the South Pacific Ocean released details of a surprise security partnership agreement with China. The announcement has drawn protests to the island's parliament and particularly drawn the ire of New Zealand. Well, let's get the latest now with Geoffrey Miller, who is a geopolitical analyst at the Democracy Project in New Zealand. Geoffrey, good evening over there to New Zealand.
Good evening, good morning to you in London.
So before we get to China and this partnership in particular, the Cook Islands are a self-governing island in a free association with New Zealand. Tell us what that means in practice.
Yes, it's an unusual constitutional status that the Cook Islands has. It's held the status for 60 years, though, since 1965. It's actually the 60th anniversary year of the status. So officially, the Cook Islands is a self-governing state in free association with New Zealand. So Cook Islanders hold New Zealand passports, and yet, for the most part, they are self-governing. And New Zealand signed a joint declaration with the Cook Islands back in 2001 that formalised some of the arrangements. And when it comes to foreign affairs, it's listed in Clause 4 of that agreement that the Cook Islands interacts with the international community as a sovereign and independent state. So New Zealand at that point was keen for the Cook Islands to be more independent. At the same time, there's also a provision in there for consultation with New Zealand. So it's a slightly contradictory agreement.
It is when you describe sort of the need for consultation, but at the same time self-governing, even on foreign policy, which does bring us to China. The Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown visited Beijing. What is this partnership with China and how did it come about?
Yes, so Mark Brown, the Cook Islands Prime Minister, went to China last week and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Beijing. And this has not been to New Zealand's liking because of this, because of these constitutional arrangements. New Zealand very much sees it, the Cook Islands is going beyond their brief here. They think that New Zealand should have been able to see this agreement first before Cook Islands signed it. Mark Brown points to the agreement, though, and says, well, we're acting as a sovereign and independent state. And in fact, in that 2001 agreement, there's even another provision which says the Cook Islands has the capacity to enter into treaties and other international agreements in its own right with governments. So New Zealand has some signer's remorse, you might say, over that 2001 agreement. Some of the frustrations are a little hard to fathom when it comes to New Zealand's qualms over this deal, because New Zealand also has a comprehensive strategic partnership with China that it signed back in 2014. And New Zealand has quite good relations with China overall. It's China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner. And New Zealand has cooperated with China on water infrastructure in the Cook Islands quite recently. So some of the hostility towards this agreement is a little hard to comprehend, but I think it comes in the context of this wider geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific, and the current foreign minister in New Zealand, Winston Peters, is pretty pro-US and pretty sceptical of China. In fact, he's yet to visit China as foreign minister, and he's been foreign minister for almost 18 months now.
Jeffrey, is there a worry as well that this kind of agreement, even if the Cook Islands was allowed to sign this, as you describe from the arrangement that they have with New Zealand, that this sort of means that there's more of a separation between the two territories, if you will, that they are going on different tracks? Is that part of what this is about?
Well, yet New Zealand and the Cook Islands both now have a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China. I would say it actually is the opposite. It's actually brought New Zealand and the Cook Islands onto the same page. Really, the reality is here that Winston Peters, the New Zealand Foreign Minister, doesn't like who the Cook Islands are signing an agreement with. The United States recognised the Cook Islands as or established diplomatic relations with the Cook Islands as a sovereign state back in 2023, and New Zealand didn't have a problem with that. And if the Cook Islands were signing an agreement with Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom, I doubt very much Winston Peters would have had any issues with it. It's the fact it's with China. And when it comes to personal relationships, Winston Peters has got a very poor relationship with Mark Brown over some things that happened last year. Mark Brown, the Cook Islands Prime Minister, wanted to introduce a separate Cook Islands passport that would sit alongside the New Zealand passport. Winston Peters vetoed that, and Mark Brown also wanted to bring the Cook Islands into the United Nations as a member there, and New Zealand also said no to that. So in a sense, there's also an element of payback to what's happening at the moment. But it's been quite extraordinary over the last couple of weeks in New Zealand. Some of the statements that have been coming out of Winston Peters' office, saying that the Cook Islands had improperly consulted with New Zealand, and saying that New Zealand didn't see eye to eye with the Cook Islands. It's all been quite unedifying, and hopefully now this deal has been signed. Winston Peters and Mark Brown do sit down and behind closed doors take this away from the media where it's largely been litigated, and work out their differences and find out a way forward.
And just finally, Jeffrey, the instigator of all this, with this being the partnership agreement with China, what is China's actual interest in this? What do we imagine they are thinking, watching all of this? Do they care, or will they just be looking on somewhat bemused that they've caused such a ruckus between the Cook Islands and New Zealand?
Of course. I mean, I think China probably is somewhat bemused by all of this, and perhaps they've had the desired effect here. But I think Winston Peters, New Zealand Foreign Minister, has fallen into the trap here. Now New Zealand is taking a more aggressive stance towards the Cook Islands in terms of its constitutional arrangements. Winston Peters gave a speech this week saying he wanted to reset relations with the Cook Islands and effectively renegotiate the constitutional relations that it has with the Cooks. And I don't think any of that's going to go down well. I mean, this heavy-handed approach, it comes across as quite paternalistic, quite colonial. In the end, what Mark Brown wants is money. He wants economic development for the Cook Islands, and that's what this agreement is largely about. It's about economic cooperation with China, development, infrastructure. And in the end, I think it's up to New Zealand to provide a better offer. It doesn't want the Cook Islands going off to Beijing or going off to other suitors. It needs to provide what the Cook Islands wants. So in the end, it's quite simple. Winston Peters needs to get his checkbook out and provide what the Cook Islands is looking for. New Zealand does provide grant money, but Mark Brown has been quite open, saying it's just not enough. New Zealand needs to provide more. So Pacific states, including the Cook Islands, have options at the moment because of this competition between China and Western states, and Mark Brown is certainly using his options.
Get the checkbook out, New Zealand. Jeffrey Miller from the Democracy Project in New Zealand, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now we turn our focus to Finland's Digital and Population Data Services Agency. The government body is responsible for the digitalization of society, from electronic identification to securing data and overall making life easier for its citizens. Earlier this month, the agency won an award for its class-leading work at the World Government Summit in Dubai. Monocle's Tom Edwards was there and got a chance to catch up with Mikko Puttakainen, the director of Finland's digital agency, and also with Mikko Matinen, the director of digital engagement and customer experience. They stopped by our Monocle booth to talk about Finland's reputation as a digital innovator and to discuss what the next frontiers are in the digital transformation. Tom began by asking Mikko Matinen about the day-to-day function of the agency.
Currently, we have like 3 international development programs going on. It's like cross-border digital services that we are currently developing. In Finland, we are seeing that the digitalization is saturating. So one of the ways to develop the services is going abroad, so doing lots of cooperation with the other Nordic countries and also with the EU member states. So that's the daily work that we are doing, and we are quite closely working with Mikko P. So many of his people are participating in these international development programs.
So Mikko P, give us a sense of your day-to-day. What do you spend most of your time doing from one day to another?
Yeah, in addition to various development projects, Finnish citizens and people in Finland in general are using a lot of digital services during their daily lives, and through our services, roughly 80% of Finnish people sign into public digital services. So we provide basic services such as e-authentication, digital post, and more advanced base register-based services such as e-authorization, where you can act on behalf of other people. So in my unit, our main task is to ensure that daily lives of people are as smooth as possible and the services are reliable and running uninterrupted.
And it's interesting, so many of the conversations in this space are about that seamlessness, the ease of operation. And yet, I guess Northern Europe and in Europe, it's a bit different. There is more cooperation, but often with global digital trends, we have to navigate borders. How challenging is it from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a simple, almost mechanical standpoint, to navigate those different interests? Because in a way, there should be no digital borders, right, Mikko? And yet we know there are. Is that part of the problem you have to navigate on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, great question, Tom. So, of course, it remains to be seen how difficult or easy it will be. We know that, for example, we have made a deal with Estonia on automating the information exchange between the two countries. So it took like 10 years when we took the long road. Now we are more or less like considering that maybe we should do like bilateral agreements between agencies just to get the things going easily. But we are tackling that question through building different kind of like proof of concepts where we can just test that is it technically possible to have these services. And Mikko has been like our mastermind on thinking regarding how to develop the services. And one of his grant ideas has been the best service is no service. So zero touch or no touch kind of like services. And this aligns quite nicely with the fact that the digitalization is saturating in Finland. So that's why we are moving more towards the kind of like services happen under the hood, and then people don't have to do anything regarding their administrative burden. So quite a long answer to you, but
but very comprehensive. And let's talk. I mentioned at the top, obviously, congratulations in order, winner, best government digital service here at WGS in Dubai. And Mikko P, let me just ask you about that, because you must be very proud, of course. Is that value that other Mikko just mentioned about almost, it's kind of less is more, right? And what is not seen, what is not engaged with. This must be great to get that kind of validation for that kind of idea. It must make you doubly happy.
Yeah, definitely. We see this prize as a very great recognition, and we are humbled to receive it from this conference. And it highlights how important it is to develop a whole service family that integrates seamlessly into your everyday service usage. So people actually often when they go to digital services, they don't actually even notice that they are using the platform services such as strong authentication, authorization, or the digital post. And Mikko mentioned about these no-touch services, and one of the very well-known examples in Finland is the tax declaration process, where you do your annual tax declaration only if you want to change something. So you get automatic end result, and then you get notification through the digital post that now if you wish to change or add something, you can go there and do. But most of the people are really happy not even touching the declaration.
I'll bet. I was going to say, can we import that into the United Kingdom? That would be nice. Just a final thought on the sort of Finnish opportunity, because it strikes me that perhaps, to use a slightly clumsy analogy, you've got huge nations with all their complexity. They're sort of like the heavyweights. They lumber around. Tiny nations where it's maybe easier to do things, but there might be a question of resource scarcity. They're maybe sort of like the featherweights. Finland is like a useful middleweight, right? Because you've got great resource, great heritage in digi innovation, maybe a perfect population size. Is Finland sort of perfectly positioned to be a leader in this? Should other countries be looking to Finland to see how to do innovation in this space better?
Kind of good analogy, but in a way we see this as like a relay race. So governments to governments, they have been funding on the digitalization projects. So for example, when we were listening Mr. Elon Musk telling about his ambitions, how to move forward, so we were just thinking that, okay, if you now start, it might be done and dusty like in 10 years. Well, maybe 5 because he's a much better businessman than we are. So anyway, but that's the key essence of it's like a relay race. There's no like quick solutions and quick and dirty kind of like tricks how you can turn the nation into digital nation. So kind of like we wish everything good and all the best for Mr. Elon Musk, but it might still take some time for him eventually.
Mikko Pittukainen and Mikko Matinen there of Finland's digital agency, speaking with Tom Edwards at the World Government Summit in Dubai. This is The Briefing. And finally today, it is set to be a busy weekend here in the city of London with London Fashion Week in full swing. And I am joined now right here in the studio by Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director. And Natalie, you have rushed here from the very first events of the day.
I did, yeah, and thank you for having me, as always.
You've managed to collect your breath, I hope, at this point. Tell us what you saw this morning.
So I started with the show by the designer Stephen Stocky Daly. It's a small independent brand, and it was hosted at the British Fashion Council's communal space on 180 Strand. But I was really positively surprised. I think it was such a strong start to a light London Fashion Week schedule. But Stephen has really matured, I think. He started with menswear, really exploring different archetypes of the British wardrobe, British tailoring, and he's now evolved into women's wear as well. And he was just saying backstage how much fun he's having now, having the two lines work together. You could also see that he's adding accessories into the mix. So this is also a brand that has business legs, I would say, and it has just the right touch of wit and British humor with some of the prints and the intarsia sweaters that he has become known for. So a really positive start. And backstage, a lot of editors were whispering as well that he might be auditioning for a job at Burberry because there were some great trench coats and some checks on the runway as well. So watch this space. We will see what he does next.
Is this how it goes in the fashion world? I'm feeling like this is like, you know, the version of like geopolitics where like a politician is like pretending to be president or campaigning for president. Is this how it works? Like you sort of use your own collection to then maybe get some other job? down the
I
line.
think it does work like this sometimes, and it's not the first time that we've seen it. I've seen a lot of designers audition indirectly for the Chanel jobs. There were a lot of tweed jackets in collections in the last year before Mathieu Blazy was announced creative director of Chanel. So I think that can happen, and also what else is happening a lot is that the editors, if it's also a designer that they do support and they like, they start these rumors on purpose to kind of influence the decision and of the brands that are looking to hire.
Very much like politicians in that as well. And when you talked, you mentioned there that there is something of a lighter schedule at London Fashion Week. Why is that, I suppose, and does that help someone like Daly highlight what he's doing?
It does help some of the younger brands that are investing in hosting shows in London. But overall, it's not the best news. There's a lot of absentees, especially the names that are drawing international buyers like J.W. Anderson. He's sitting the season out. Also, a lot of the smaller but really popular, beloved brands like names like Molly Goddard, 16 Ardington, that had become kind of favorites in the schedule, are also deciding to take a break. And there's also brands that have had to shut operations completely. People like Christopher Kane is kind of someone that comes top of mind because of the aftermath of Brexit, the pandemic, a lot of UK retailers shutting down as well, and who used to support these brands. So it is a period of transition for the London fashion industry, but I think there's still talent to discover. People like Stephen are really worth buyers' attention still. And I think the British Fashion Council itself is undergoing a lot of change. There will be a new CEO starting in April. So I'm hopeful that we can turn this around.
And in terms of how this Fashion Week started, there was a bit more of a theatrical big open with Harry Reid. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's become a bit of a tradition to start the Fashion Week on Thursday night with Harry Reid's show. This one was held at Tate Britain, so the venue itself was beautiful and very operatic music. And we had Florence Pugh come in and recite a poem. She was speaking about being yourself and being fearless, which is what his brand is really about. So it was a nice start, and it will continue through the weekend, I hope.
I should, of course, say Harris Reid. I'm bringing my politics into this as well. This is Harry Reid from the US.
Excused.
Harris Reid, obviously, is the one that we were talking about there. Tell us a little bit more about what's happening this weekend as well.
So I'm really excited for the Sunday shows, where it's three of my favorite female designers, one after the other as well. So there's Roxanda Ilincic, who's a Serbian designer, and she's a former architect, so she always draws a really interesting crowd of interiors designers, architects, artists that always support her. There's Amelia Wickstead, a New Zealand designer. Again, she has a community of her own. And then I think everyone's favorite is Simone Rocha, Irish designer, the daughter of John Rocha, who was a very established name in the UK. And it's really interesting to see her. She was the up-and-comer just a few years ago, it feels like. But now I think she's really managed to build a business. She's opened stores in New York, in Taipei, in London. And with all these absentees, I think Simone is the designer who's really drawing in the editors and the buyers from abroad, especially from the US, who still make the trip to London for Fashion Week.
The buyers from abroad, but also these designers. Interesting that you mentioned Serbia, New Zealand, Ireland. It's all these sort of London transplants that are showing their faces here at London Fashion Week.
Exactly. I think there is a little bit of disappointment around everything that's happening in London and like we were saying, the lighter schedule, but there's still this melting pot of cultures and influences and a lot to discover.
Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have more from you next week. But that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researchers were Ryuma Takahashi and Maisie Ringer. And our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Hunter Wang and Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Have a good weekend. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.